So first off, please join me in welcoming Ray Dalio to the stage.
Wow. Fuck yeah. Ray Dalio.
Thank you.
Oh my God, real legit. We got Ray Dalio.
We'll let your winners ride.
Rain Man David Sack.
And instead, we open source it to the fans, and they've just gone crazy with it.
Love you, Besties. Queen of Quinoa.
Ray, I don't know how we got you to the stage. It must have been the fact that I just said your name 400 times last year.
This guy's ready
But-
to
not be bored.
Yeah, but I will say you were by far my top choice as a guest to have at the All In Summit 2023, which I took advantage of because I got to produce it this year. You guys have heard me talk about Ray's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail on the pod a lot. And I think it really encapsulates so well why we are observing a lot of the social, economic, and political shifts that are underway in the US and around the world today. Increasing civil unrest, divisive politics, our desire for external conflict, inflation, budget and debt problems, et cetera. They've all played out before as nations have risen and fallen. Jason likes to make fun of the term declinists, but I think it's more broader than that, which is what is the cycle that happens with social systems that we call nation states over time. Ray's book was my content pick of the year in 2021, and I first learned about Ray when he published Principles as a PDF in 2011. You put that out for free on the internet, thank you, which was an internal document you used at Bridgewater. And I don't know if anyone else downloaded it and read it, but I was a young CEO in 2011. I read that PDF, and it made a big impact on me and how I thought about management, prioritization, decision-making, and myself. As a kid growing up in Nassau County, New York, Ray earned money mowing lawns, shoveling snow, delivering newspapers, and caddying for Wall Street tycoons. He later got a summer job with a Wall Street trader that he caddied for and ended up starting Bridgewater 2 years after he got his MBA at Harvard in 1973, make sure I get that right. By 2013, Bridgewater was the largest hedge fund in the world, today managing well over $100 billion in assets. Ray spends much of his time sharing his analyses and thoughts today, and his viewpoints openly and freely. And for that, we appreciate him and thank him and are excited to welcome him here today. So, Ray, maybe you could just very briefly kind of summarize the cycle that you highlight in your book that I mentioned, and the 5 great kind of drivers that you've observed, and tell us a little bit about the simple kind of macro picture. I know you've got something you could share on it as well.
Yeah, sure. First, I should explain that experience I had of learning that many of the things that surprised me because they didn't happen in my lifetime before, but they happened many times in history. The first time I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1971, and the United States, Nixon defaulted on the promise to deliver gold for money because they didn't have enough money, real money, gold, and it went down. I went on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting a big down. It went up a lot. That's because I never had a devaluation. If it happened that, I found that in March 1933, the exact same thing happened with Roosevelt on the radio, same thing. So then I studied the 30s, what happened in 1938 in terms of the depression leading to the wars and so on, and the interest rates hitting zero is the exact same thing that happened in 2008. It was because I studied that we were able to make a lot of money in the 2008 financial crisis. So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before, and I needed, therefore, to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose then had January 6th came out after the book, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were two others that had enormous impact. The two others were acts of nature, in particular droughts, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue now. And then number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's this cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationships. I have a clip here, if I can show you.
Please.
Just the 4 minutes. That's just a brief summary of the cycle. Can you hit it with the clip?
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
The book's amazing, and the amount of work you put into this is extraordinary, and it's just really great intellectually. I'm curious, when we look at those four groups, since you wrote the book, China, I think we'd all agree, has changed significantly. Perhaps, I think, best described maybe being in decline in many ways and disconnecting from the West. And it's also, I believe, when you look at the countries you studied, perhaps one of the only modern authoritarian countries to, perhaps have an ability to take the crown if they were to continue. So, two-part question: how does everything you've learned and studied impact your thinking when one person, an authoritarian, Xi Jinping, is running China and disconnecting it from the rest of the world in terms of their ability? And then do you consider this, if they did succeed in becoming the dominant power in the world, what do you think that does for humanity?
There are a bunch of questions in there,
Yeah.
so I'll try to remember them and take them once at a time. I think China's going to be a big power for the foreseeable future. I think the basic picture in China, the United States, the emergence of India, and so on, is the world order is going to change in a very profound way. We can't say who's going to be the winner and the loser of this game, but I think we do know that this conflict is going to be with us, and it's totally changing the world order. When you're asking, like, who's going to be the winner of this game, I'll tell you history. In the history of democracy, as Plato described in the Republic, there's a cycle, and one of the great vulnerabilities of democracies is the disorderliness, the anarchy that comes from a conflict. And so you're asking me to compare democracy and also what I'll call capitalism with authoritarianism and let's call it communism, that version of it.
Or quasi-capitalism, maybe.
But we know what we mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So, when the risk of capitalism is when you have the wealth gap clash and the opportunity gap clash, and the risk, and that produces risk for democracy. So, in the 30s, 4 major democracies, because of that dynamic, their parliaments chose to be autocracies. That happened in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. So both have risks. I came from, and we've all been blessed with this amazing environment, that equal opportunity, the ability to be creative, rule of law, civility. But if we risk those things, in both of those, then we have a great risk. So on this war, I think it depends more on how we are with our circumstances to be strong and capable, and relative to them. It certainly is going to be a test of the systems.
Yeah. So, in a way, us focusing inward on what we do here in America with our democracy and making it high function is as important as managing our relationship with China. And if you were to look at China and India, and those two countries specifically, and you were to handicap them, as you are uniquely qualified to do, maybe you could just broadly handicap India versus China for us, because this is a topic we've been talking about, Chamath and I and the other besties on the show a whole bunch. And it's now the largest population in the world. I guess people don't realize that they've, and they're continuing to grow, and the birth rate is in decline in China. So maybe a little bit on India and how you look at it.
And I should emphasize that every conclusion that I have is a function of measuring statistics and having them as leading indicators. And we have 10-year growth rate estimates for India, all the countries, top 22 countries, and you can see it online if you want, country by country, and the reasons for it. India has the highest potential growth rate. I think India is where China was when I started to go. I started to go in 1984. So if you look at the complexion, the per capita income, and I think Modi is a Deng Xiaoping, so that you have a massive reform, development, creativity, all those elements. There are, of course, issues, risk issues, but India is very, very important. Now, of course, there's a religious internal issue having to do with the population has 240 million Muslims, and I don't think that any of these issues is going to stop India. I also, in history, the countries that were the neutral countries did the best. So in other words, better than the winners in wars. So as we have this conflict between the United States and China and its allies, Russia, and so on, as we see that line up, countries that are in the middle, like India, are going to be net beneficiaries of that.
Middle East?
Yeah.
Middle East is, again, there are two big epicenters where things are happening fast and quick and getting better. One of them is, let's say three. There's the ASEAN countries, and we can say that Singapore essentially is a hub, but the ASEAN countries, which is, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and all of that, that's going to be a great area. The Middle East, in terms of particularly the Gulf countries, the amount of money, and they're making talent magnets. They're attracting people. You look at how the change in wealth has taken place. That's certainly it. And India.
Ray, can I just ask back on China? You know Chinese leadership. You've spoken and had relations there for many years. Can you share with us your point of view on how they think about their position in the world and how you understand their intentions?
Yes, I'll give you my thoughts. I'm not making judgments. I'm just passing along. Okay. They think there are two different systems, two different approaches. They would think that an autocratic and an autocratic system. They used to have a committee that would make it, but they would say it would be very much like a company. If you had a company, you have a board, you have the executive committee, and so on and so forth, and you make sure you get the leadership. And then they would say that the world should have a competition, and that throughout history, there are these competitions in all the various ways we talk about, and there's an emergence of that, and that there's an inevitability, and I think we say that there's an inevitability for a conflict, because there's a containment, and then there's a desire to expand, and it's like almost keeping a lid on a boiling pot. That's the type of situation. I can go on at length about the particulars of their thing. They have a very good historical perspective because their history's been literally 5,000 years. Like if we think of ours, they remember the particulars, and all the leaders study that, and there is a cycle that they're very conscious about. So, for example, the big risk that they believe is instability. So Xi says that the big storm on the horizon. He keeps referring to the big storm on the horizon. And that relates to the conflict in the world that we're talking about. But it also relates to the fact that they've got a debt problem. They have a debt restructuring problem. And their instinct through history, the learning of history, is that during such periods of time, internal conflict is a big threat, and therefore autocracy, strong controls are the things to have. Okay, now we can explore the relative merits of that internal conflict and so on, but that's basically their perspective.
One of the things that I'm struck by is if you look in the past, a lot of these conflicts were started because it's about commerce or some form of capital or some critical resource. And then it just kind of like escalates, and then you have these like large retransformations and reallocations of power. But in a world where we are now sort of almost on the precipice, closer than we've ever been to this sort of form of abundance, whether it's quasi-costless energy, whether it's food that's available to be printed or made or what have you, what do we fight over in this next great conflict? Like, what is worth fighting over?
Okay, so let me first deal with the productivity thing. Throughout history, productivity's been the greatest. And so if you take the 20s, we had the productivity, most inventions, most patents, and so on in the 20s. You also had a debt problem, and you also had a wealth gap problem. I believe that in terms of the new technology, we're going to really see new technologies. Now, they can be used for weapons, or they can be used for productivity, but we're going to have a reorganization of how are we going to redistribute the wealth and opportunities and so on. So if we come back, I think we just have to look at what are we fighting for now? What's going on? And I think that, of course, there's a fight over money. If you have a downturn, if you have a debt problem, and I think there's good reason to believe we will, we can get into that in a minute, but they fight over money, and they fight over differences in values. In other words, the differences in values, like how do you educate your children? What is transgender issues and education issues and those types of things. And so I think you're seeing those things to fight over. You're seeing plenty to fight over. And let's say we don't fight. Let's pray we don't fight. What we need is to come together. But if, let's say, we don't fight, you're still going to have to deal with how do you redistribute not only money, but how do you redistribute opportunities? And that's going to take figuring it out, right? And there's going to be an argument over how they do that.
No, I think this is really interesting, because I think you're saying if you don't fight over the historic area battlefields, right? If we're not fighting over resources, we are going to fight over social issues or social constructs or social beliefs. So
But I'm also saying you're going to fight over resources. Like, we have debt, and we'll operate as though it doesn't matter, and we'll continue to have the pile. If you look at history, and we can get into why it is not that goes on a while. And you can't continue to increase your living standards by borrowing more than you're spending. You know, you can't keep accumulating your debt because it has to matter. So these types of things, as they build up, as the debt builds up, as the wealth gaps builds up, and the values gaps build up, and then there's difference in reaction to controls. Some people, so you see the movement. We will have things to fight over at the same time as we hopefully will have a productivity miracle. I think that in the next 5 years, I think year by year, we're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years as each one of those things comes to pass. First with the elections as we have, then we have the conflict with the geopolitical conflict, then we have the climate issue, which, by the way, is a very expensive issue. We should talk about how costly that issue is. And then we're going to have this issue of technology, which can provide the greatest miracle, but also is a weapon.
Just frame for us your thoughts on debt for a second. How do you think about debt as an absolute construct or a relative construct, especially sovereign debt? You know, there is a U.S. debt, but then there are also every other 182 countries who have a ton of debt. And so how do you think about debt to GDP relatively and in absolute terms?
For any country, and quite often many countries, because they go through the cycle together, as they did in the 30s, what happens is debt rises relative to incomes. And what that means mechanistically is that debt service payments rise relative to incomes. And so it squeezes out consumption as this compounds. And happens is there's a realization that they have to print money. So I think you're going to see in the next downturn another move to print money. There are certain things that are going on now that means that the big risk comes when they don't want to hold those bonds anymore, okay? Because the supply-demand, think about that supply-demand. It has a deficit, it has to borrow, and so it sells its bonds. Who are the buyers of the bonds? Why do they buy? The buyers of the bonds buy because there's an attractive return. Not only do you have to sell those amounts of bonds, but when they start to realize that I'm not getting good returns on those bonds, they can sell those bonds. There are $31 trillion of bonds.
What would they own instead?
They always own tangible things, and those things can also be, it could be equities, it could be many other things. It could be gold, okay? Gold has always been accepted as a money because nobody else's, there's a saying, gold is the only asset you can have, that not somebody else's liability. In other words, you're dependent on getting paid. Right. You can have that at intrinsic value, and for a long period of time, it's been valued and you can move it between countries. But also, different countries prosper. So you'll see some of the countries that we mentioned, they will prosper through that. The United States made most of its money because it didn't enter the war. It was before, on World War II and World War I, the United States became the richest country because of the money it made before it entered the war. So those countries will prosper, and in those countries, then certain real estate will prosper, hard assets. But where you have that is very, very important.
There's something about wealth inequality that I just wanted to get your thoughts on as well, which is, I saw a chart in The Economist recently that showed on a purchasing price parity basis, normalized across all the Western countries, that U.S. median income, so not thinking about means, is now $45,000, almost $47,000, doing much better than Britain, most of continental Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So on a functional purchasing power parity basis, a lot of Americans are doing much, much better. There was like a UPS renegotiation for their labor contracts. Drivers can now make $180,000 a year. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made, but then there's this real but also hyper-perceived imbalance. And I just want to get your sense of how much of this is the social media phenomenon of just never having enough, and how much of it is true when you look at data like that?
There's a huge wealth gap, and the nature of our economy is producing this, so I can rattle off a bunch of statistics. What happened, as happens in these cycles, is that when you have the type of situation we have, the government will take on the debt and it'll send out the money. So the mechanics of that were that there was more checks and more money sent than there was loss of income by a lot. So a lot of money went out, and as a result of that, the financial conditions of the household sector improved, generally speaking, while the financial conditions of the government sector, the government got into a lot more debt. That's very classic at the end of the cycle. Because there's an imbalance between demand and purchases of bonds, there's the central bank buying those bonds, that monetization. Okay, so now that's what the wealth gap looks like. And also that also creates more of the inflation. Right. Because the household sector, by and large, benefits. But when you look at the differences, I'll tell you a personal case so that I can understand. I live in Connecticut, and Connecticut's usually 1, 2, or 3 in the richest states in the country. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut either have dropped out of high school or are failing classes with absentee rates of greater than 25%. The $600 million a year goes to incarcerations. There is a level below which no human beings should be allowed to, let alone raising kids and families. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, a wealthy place. My number won't be up to date, maybe 5 years old. Per capita students in high school costs would be $24,000 a person. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, up the road, $14,000 a person. There were 60,000 kids in Connecticut that didn't have computers. How were they going to get education? The state wasn't going to pay for it. We philanthropically bought them. So now we don't create a bottom, an acceptable bottom. And the idea of equal opportunity, I mean, I was blessed with it. I think we probably all were blessed with equal opportunity. All you need is the parents will take care of you, go to a public school, come out to a world of equal opportunity and learn civility. If you have those things. So if you take all those measures and so on, the gaps in those things are greater than they have ever been.
Right.
Let me ask, so Ray, I think I fundamentally agree with your critique that America is looking more and more like a late-stage empire. Like a late-stage Roman Empire, we have this massive debt and we're debasing our currency. Like the Roman Empire, we have all these, far-flung military wars, which we lose, all over the world. We're racked by internal division. So I think I agree with that part of it. At the same time, we do seem to be really good still at technological innovation. In the last year, we've had this breakthrough with, AI, with large language models. I'm wondering, well, first of all, is that a mirage, or do you agree with that? And then if you do agree that we're still really good at technology, is there anything in the historical pattern that's like that, where you have an empire that's declining in every visible way, except for the one that really undergirds our power, which is technology?
Well, the late 20s in the United States is such a good classic example. We had more innovations, more all of these cycles. If I was to go back to the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, and then you create, when there's a lot of debt and a big wealth gap, you have in 1907, you have the Panic of 1907, boom, you have you have this internal conflict, and you had the First World War. In the 20s, you had the same kind of late 20s. It was an era of great inventiveness. The other things matter.
So just because we're really great at innovation isn't going to save us if all these other things are broken.
It's a wonderful thing, but ultimately, we as a society, in aggregate, are spending a lot more money than we're earning. So, if we're doing such a good job on that technology, whatever it is, why is that happening? Okay, so now when you look at the debt, do you want to own the debt? Do you want to own that? When those who don't want to own it, then you have a financial problem. When you have a financial problem at the same time as you have a wealth gap and populism, that's a dangerous combination at the same time as you have an external. So it's a very risky, I'm with you, but
Ray, let me just follow up there. So you mentioned populism. I think I have a slightly different definition. I don't want to debate semantics with you. I think populism is a reaction to the failure of elites. So all the people managing our fiscal situation and our foreign policy who've gotten us into all these unnecessary conflicts, who've debased our currency. I see populism as people rising up to reject their leadership. Now, it's a bad thing that they're not willing to accept the results of elections.
I agree with your definition.
Okay.
I agree with your definition. And then also, at the same time that's happening, they'll win at all costs. They won't compromise. They will win. They will fight for that side and win.
Okay, fair enough, and that's not good. But, I guess my question is, why don't you have more criticism for our elites who are running all these institutions, who are making these decisions?
I do. I mean, it depends what you're... I wrote a piece about four years ago which says why and how capitalism needs to be reformed. Yeah. And I believe that on these issues of equal opportunity and all that, we've got a big structural problem. And that everything needs to be reformed. I'm not against capitalism, but it needs to be reformed. And part of the big problem, just analytically, mechanically, is that the profit system alone does not direct resources adequately. Let's say if we take climate, for example. There are costs, terrible costs that come from climate. It's not built into the system, education. Look at the gaps in education. The structural system means that the central government, the state government controls education. Then you get to the town, and at the town level, it's the town that controls the education, how much they pay. And so then you create wealth gaps with rich people being able to take care of their kids in a way that other people can't take care of their kids. And that creates an opportunity gap. That's a structural problem. It has to be taken on looked at, reformed, and in order to pull this thing off, we have to do it together. Okay, we cannot do it with one side fighting the other side with irreconcilable differences.
Ray, before we run out of time, amazingly well said, and what an amazing conversation. If we were to get prescriptive here in the last couple of minutes we have, if America wants to continue to be the leader, or at least in a lead position here in the free world, what should we focus on? What would you say are the top three things?
Let me add one question to that, and it connects these two. Is there a political solution in the U.S. to avoid the end of empire? Or is it a function of physics? And I think this is a big part of Sachs's point of view, that there's a solution, we need to change these people. Or are there too many, call it conflating forces, social forces, economic forces, that all kind of rise and fall together? That
it's inevitable.
And it becomes an inevitability that there's a cycling.
There are pre-existing conditions that represent challenges. So, for example, the amount of debt that we're in represents you can't pretend it, it exists. So it represents a challenge. There are a lot of these challenges, but it is not inevitable. What is needed is, first of all, a strong middle, okay, to bring the country together in terms of, rather than to have this fighting, because if we continue the way we will, we're going to have a conflict. And then there needs to be a good engineering exercise that's going to produce, but it has to be bipartisan. It has to be bipartisan with that strong middle, taking control of the extremes, because neither side's going to win.
A great reformation.
So, and that reformation I think should take the form of, if I was president of the United States, what I would do is I'd have
on the table,
bipartisan cabinet. I'm not running for president, but a bipartisan cabinet, and then have an engineering exercise, much like the Manhattan Project, in which those bipartisan people get together and properly engineer important changes that need to be made. They have to be structural. We will not agree with each other ever. We're going to kill each other fighting over these things. So structural changes have to be made, and you need to have the country as a whole do those things.
Do you guys think that's naive, or is it feasible?
I think that the way politics works is that you don't somehow come together in the middle. I think one side has to win in the eyes of voters. Voters have to choose a path. And
that's, I'm with you, that's what's going to happen. And okay.
We've had moderate
We're
stuff.
going to have an interesting 2 years between where we are now and, let's say, almost 2 years, and let's say early 2025, okay?
Hey, Ray.
And not just interesting because we're going to have unbelievable elections, and we'll see how we can come together. We're going to have an interesting on how China-U.S. relations are. We're going to have an interesting financial conflict, and we're going to have radical technology changes, plus climate's going to be an issue. So,
Ray, you've, Mr. Dalio,
Ray.
you've accomplished more than anybody could ever expect in life, financially with your company, and intellectually, obviously, you've given this a tremendous amount of thought. And you said you're not running for president. I wonder, there's not much time left. You should maybe consider running for president. And why not do it? Why not? What's the argument to be so successful, so rich, so intellectually curious, and not do what the country needs you to do, which is get in the arena? We need you, Mr. Dalio. Get in the arena.
Thank you.
Who wants him in the arena? Let's go.
Thank you.
This is the same speech he has for Jeff Bezos.
I'm very complimented. That was a very nice and generous compliment. Thank you very much.
Why? Seriously, on a personal level, take me through it.
Well, okay. I would give up my life for the country. Okay. But Mario Draghi in Italy, if you know the story, he knows the system and how it works. And that if you don't have unitedness and operating in that way, everybody's going to be torn apart. And so I think whatever thoughts I have, if these are helpful thoughts, I think my best role is to pass along whatever helpful thoughts I have. And then the population as a whole deals with those thoughts. So I'm making my best contribution that I can, I feel. That's my best capacity. And then it's up to the people.
You're so vibrant.
People, please join me in thanking Ray Dalio for his contribution.
Amazing. Give it up. That was incredible. Thank you, Mr. Dalio. Incredible. Wow. Look at this. Standing out. First one. First standing ovation of all of these.
Let your winners ride.
Rain Man David Sack.
And instead, we open source it to the fans, and they've just gone crazy with it.
Love you, Besties. Queen of quinoa.
Let your winners ride.
Besties are back.
Gold 13. That is my dog taking a notice in your driveway.
Oh, man.
My haberdasher will meet me at place. We should all just get a room and just have one big huge orgy because they're all just useless. It's like this sexual tension that they just need to release somehow. Wet your beak. Wet your beak.
Your beak.
That's gonna be good. We need to get merch. Besties are back.
I'm going all in.